Hey, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your break. If you don't know me yet, my name is Claire Alston, and I am the Membership and Operations Manager for the CPR Institute. So for all things membership, I'm your gal. If you are a CPR member, I'd like to invite you to an informal Zoom hang we're having from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern on March 23rd. We'll be talking about committees, so if you're curious about getting involved in that way, it'd be a great time to stop by and say hey. Now, though, I do have to switch gears to something truly terrifying, which is your cybersecurity risk. Scary topic, really great panel, so pros and cons. We're so excited today to have this panel moderated by Micaela Mcmurrough from Covington and Burling. These experts, they're going to have you changing all of your passwords to something really, really long and complicated. I personally may never open another attachment again. We'll just have to see how this shakes out. After the panel discussion, don't go away because we will be breaking out into groups to discuss the case study in your CLE materials. So that'll be really fun. I hope you stick around.
All right, great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for the cyber risk panel. I'm delighted to be here. I'm your moderator, Micaela Mcmurrough. I have an absolute group of luminaries here. I'm really excited to see my co-panelists, Wendy, Anna, Avi, and Sunita. We are going to have a number of interesting topics to talk about today and get everybody's input. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to jump right in. And, as I go to different questions on different panelists, I'll ask each panelist too to give you a brief introduction of just your background and your view of things. So we're going to kick it right off. Cybersecurity risk, right? A few years ago, a lot of people might not even know what that means. Today, folks have a different view. A lot of people are familiar with it, but just to level set here with some foundations. When we talk about cybersecurity and cyber risk, what are we really talking about, right? What is cyber risk and why should we care? And I'm going to kick it over to Wendy, our technical expert, to get us started here.
Hi, Micaela. Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here today. I appreciate the invite. As as a non-lawyer on the panel, I appreciate the inclusion and the diversity of opinion here. So, and very excited to hear the other panelists' opinions as well. But, a common definition of cyber risk is really the risk of depending on cyber resources, right? But the reality is, all of us are taking that definition of risk every day as we operate businesses, because we operate so many of those resources are absolutely critically necessary to do work. So in my experience, I really look at cyber risk as the definition of the attack surface that an organization maintains in order to do business. So that can vary really widely depending on your client set. So if that organization needs to depend on data in different geographic locations, if it's on individual workstations, if that data resides in applications in the cloud, on premises, but again, maybe those premises are multiple geographic locations, then you can really have a pretty varying degree of cyber risk that you're taking. Also, we really look at it at Palo Alto Networks as it relates to data and defining what is the most critical data that your organization has access to and needs to do business. And once you identify that scope, you can really start peeling back the layers in terms of identifying who has access to it. Is it only employees? Is it very clearly firewalled off between different access controls? Or is it available to third-party contractors and outside parties? So all of those factor in. And then ultimately, what I also find interesting just about kicking this off with cyber risk, and my background is in incident response. So I've been conducting investigations into the largest data breaches for the last 20 years, and have had an opportunity to see a wide variety of organizations deal with and respond to these types of attacks. And it is always the central governing decision maker is business risk, right? What type of risk are we able to take on while we're investigating this threat? And that governs the decisions to, remove a threat immediately, to get back to operational business, maybe more quickly than the technical team might recommend, just given the scope of a potential attack. And so it's such a central component to any discussion that I think we have today at a variety of business levels, right? Certainly at a technical level, but I think at the most senior levels of executives as well.
Wendy, that's amazing. So we heard you talk about sort of key and critical information for your entity. We heard you talk about business risk and business continuity, which I think is connected to that idea of what are your critical systems and what's your critical information. We heard you talk a little bit about the attack surface and what that looks like, and also about incident response. And I think everyone on this call really comes from an incident response background, and I think that's helpful to call out up front. One of the reasons why is because a lot of the other management of cyber risk comes from that experience walking through incidents, right? That is how you know how to advise other people in incidents. And it's also how you know how to prepare for an incident, because you know what you might be called on to do. So really interesting way to kick it off from a technical standpoint. So Avi, I'm going to kick it over to you and kind of put the same question to you from a legal standpoint, right? When we talk about cybersecurity risk, what are we talking about? How should we be thinking about that in the context of the law?
Sure. So, and thank you, Micaela. And I 100% agree with Wendy that, I mean, cybersecurity is protecting your data from unauthorized access, and cyber risk is that it didn't work. And so the attackers get in, and it's ransomware, it's business email compromise, it's theft of IP, it's destruction of your equipment, it's having to pay a ransom, it's all those things. And then there's the regulatory litigation risk that can come with that. So if regulators or plaintiffs' lawyers feel like you weren't doing what you were supposed to be doing to protect this data, then aside from all the business and operational problems that you'll have with a cyber attack, you also will have regulatory scrutiny and maybe a regulatory enforcement action and litigation that results from you either telling people that you were doing things that you weren't doing or not meeting your regulatory obligations, some of which are not very concrete. And so, there's this sort of after the fact type kind of retroactive regulation where you're supposed to have a reasonable cybersecurity measures. You get hacked and someone takes a look at what your policies, procedures, training mechanisms were, and a regulator or plaintiff's lawyer or judge says, we think whatever you did wasn't good enough. And that's why the attackers got in, or that's why once they were in, they were able to do what they were going to do. And so, there's two pieces to that. It's what did you do to protect your network from the original attack? And what did you do once they were in your network to detect them, to isolate them, to contain the attack, to be resilient? And you could sort of not meet expectations on any one of those things. And that will result in business operational risk, as well as litigation and regulatory risk.
Terrific. So we've talked about what does it mean? What does cybersecurity mean? What is cyber risk? What does that look like from a technical standpoint and a legal standpoint? But I think we should really dive right in here to like the current threat landscape. And I have to say this would have been a different question possibly a week or 10 days ago, even than it is today. And the one lesson is that it's constantly evolving in unexpected ways. But Wendy, I'm going to come back to you. I'd love to have our participants hear about what is happening right now with respect to cyber risk. What are the trends? What's the latest you can provide in terms of cyber threat, right? Who are the players and what are they doing?
Yes. Okay, I believe I'm unmuted now. It seems like there might be some muting going on in the background as well. But yeah, so I mean, my goodness, Micaela, what a time to be having this discussion, right? Certainly with what's going on in the world right now, cyber warfare and the leveraging of different types of cyber weapons is, I think, forefront in everyone's mind. We're seeing that occur right now between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has traditionally been at the forefront of developing a lot of these types of techniques, having very strong capabilities in this arena. So organizations throughout the world have seen these types of attacks occur. Now, very clearly move towards is this landscape that is consistently evolving, but what's very consistent about it is that it's a constant crisis one after the other. So there have been a tremendous amount of vulnerabilities that have occurred. So everything from, the most recent being Log4j, but prior to that, certainly SolarWinds made headlines last year. And so you have these teams of defenders, much like mine, incident responders, analysts, who are constantly working around the clock to identify, again, I mentioned that attack surface earlier. So understanding each organization that we work with, what is the variety of their attack surface? Where are they actually vulnerable to these latest disclosures? And those are coming from everyone from nation state actors to hacktivists to cyber criminals. And I think to round that out, certainly on the cyber criminal component, we are seeing today such a tremendous amount of activity in ransomware. I'm sure that's at the very forefront of so many legal minds here on the call today, because it's simply the reality of the world that we live in. Every organization that has an online presence has an opportunity to potentially be victimized by these attacks. And so while there's a lot going on that's not fantastic news, I think the one thing that I see that really does leave me cautiously optimistic is the amount of threat intelligence sharing that I see in a rapid fashion. And especially with the current crisis that's going on right now, I have never seen teams work together more closely. So information between the US federal government, international law enforcement and intelligence sharing agencies, companies in the commercial sector who may compete for business, really rapidly sharing information so that we can protect citizens throughout the world. So I'm heartened by that. I think that that's a good indicator of a trend to come, but it's certainly no time like the present, right, for that type of behavior, because we need it now more than ever.
I saw a lot of heads nodding on the panel when you talked about a lot of heads nodding on activity. I think it's clear that folks on this call have seen an increase in activity over the last activity on multiple fronts. And that brings us to the incident response discussion, right? So we talked a little bit about the foundations of cyber terminology, cybersecurity risk. We've talked about the threat update, sort of unprecedented activity in unprecedented ways right now. Lots of threat action, but also some really positive developments too, including the information sharing across organizations and between public and private entities. But really, when it comes down to individual entities, what the threat means is that they're facing a particular cyber incident or cyber risk, right? So what happens? What happens when you get that call that you've got systems, you've got lock notices, you're unable to get to your files? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to shift to cyber incident response, and for this, I'm going to go to Sunita. Sunita, what can you tell us about cyber incident response? How do you approach it? What is it? And how do you think about it when you get called onto the scene to help clients with these issues?
Certainly. And first of all, thank you. It's nice to see everyone. My big piece of advice of these is that everyone needs to have one. Every organization needs to be thinking about how they'll respond, because it is an individualized, tailored approach. And what it is it's a plan on how to deal with an attack, how to detect it, how to limit it, and what you're going to do next. And what you don't want to do is sort of realize, get attacked, and then have to scramble to figure out who's supposed to be doing what, where's our data, what is our data, and so on. And in this day and age, it's a bit like, the bikes on your rooftop. It's not when you're going to drive into the garage and get your bike hit, same thing. It's your company is going to suffer some sort of cyber attack. So it's not a matter of if, but when. And so it's important for companies to sit down and do that and consider even a tabletop exercise. Certainly, if indeed you're the victim of attack, then the idea is with that plan in place, you should follow the plan. But obviously the first point is to actually have that and have thought through it and have to make sure you've exploited the weaknesses in advance.
Any particulars about the plan? So right, step one of risk management, have a written plan, have a plan of what you're going to do. As we often hear when we're talking to clients, the first time you're thinking about cyber issues, hopefully is not when you're actually responding to the incident, right? So forcing yourself to have the plan, having the tabletop exercises and exercising the plan, those are good ideas. But what are some of the other things that you can do And what are the best practices in terms of what that plan looks like? And Anna, I'll put that question to you.
Yeah, thanks. And hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here today. I wish I had like a magic bullet for you, but it's just like, it's like when you make a big Thanksgiving meal, it's going to be, what can I get done before the meal? It's going to be a pretty, like, it's be prepared, test your plan, do a tabletop, talk to your board, talk to your business leaders. You do not want to be figuring out answers with me at 11 o'clock on a Sunday to some of these questions that you could have figured out beforehand. It's a lot of the mundane stuff that you could get beforehand. So who is going to be responsible for making a decision about a ransom? Who is going to be responsible for telling the board? Does the board have to approve of any certain decisions? Who are our vendors going to be? All of these are things that you could have done well ahead of time. Like you could have your Wendy on retainer. You could have your ransomware negotiator on retainer. There's no reason to wait until an incident occurred to get all of these pieces in place. And the other thing I would say is, like, when we think about attack surface and risk has to be managed, I think, at the right level. And it's one of the mistakes that we kind of see a lot of companies make, is that they put so much of their cyber risk management siloed into either their IT or their CISO organization, and they're not really thinking about it as an overarching business risk. I think that's really changed in the last 24 months. But what I'd say is, like, really be prepared. A lot of the stuff that's going to come up in that first 72 hours is stuff that you really could have at least pressure tested or had some degree of preparation for before, everything kind of hits the fan at, it's always a Friday night. All of that stuff, get your house in order. If you're making a big meal, you have everything cut, everything's ready to go. You're not, figuring out the recipe 30 minutes before everyone shows up. I mean, sometimes you are, but you want to minimize decisions really for those first 72 hours, I'd say. And then I think, one thing we touched on a little bit was like pitfalls. It's like I said, the things that are going to slow you down those first 72 hours are going to be the silliest things, like not knowing who your relationship banker is when you have to pay a ransom, not knowing who their backup is if you can't get a hold of them. These are all questions, like, think through the most mundane, silliest, painful details that you can before an incident occurs.
That's great. So planning, right? Start early and start thinking about these things in advance outside the context of an incident. I think you talk about the Thanksgiving analogy as well. There's a lot to get done, but it's also timing, right? Like when things happen and in what order to make it all come together at the end, right? I think that there are timing questions as well. What needs to come first? What needs to come second? What needs to come third, et cetera. And, in some of the preparation, I think that things like you want to have your plan, right? You get your plan, you look at your IRP every so often, you dust it off and you review the incident response plan and see if it needs updates, and then you test it. And then after you test it, then you update it again based on, what happened. So, I think that there are sort of steps you can take in a certain order to kind of get things ready for an incident. Any other thoughts?
on that,
Sunita or Avi, any other thoughts on incident response?
I was going to say, and on that note, I think that's just an important point, that if your company acquires a new subsidiary or divests of a certain one, it's always good to reconsider and look at that, because I do think sometimes people think, okay, I have a response plan, I'm good to go. And the key here is you have to keep updating it and reconsidering as the data needs of your own company change.
It's a great point, and I think that the landscape can change in different ways. So one, your business landscape can change, right? Through an acquisition, through a divestiture, there are things that can happen where, your business looks different from day one to day two. And the other thing that's moving is the threat landscape, right? So we heard from Wendy at the beginning. So you've got kind of multiple moving parts. Your business is changing and the threat landscape is changing, and you kind of need to be fixing the plane as you're flying it, if you will, because you've got like lots of moving parts here. Avi, I welcome any thoughts on the incident response aspects and preparation from you as well.
Sure. And I mean, I'll come at it from after the fact. So in terms of like what happens after the incident, I mean, one of the things we always ask is, did anybody use the incident response plan? I mean, anyone pick it up and actually use it? And like, I'd say 50% of the time, the answer is no. Nobody even looked at it. It's like, well, then the incident response plan isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. And why was that? Was it not user friendly? Did it not apply to the circumstances that you had? Was it too generic? Was it too long? Whatever it is, let's fix it. And let's try and at least create an incident response plan for the incident we just had that would actually work. And while it's fresh in everybody's mind, who did what? Let's have the roles assigned. Let's have some checklists. Let's have contact information. Let's make it useful. And then ask ourselves, okay, we just had a ransomware attack. Now we've got an incident response plan that works for a ransomware attack. Would it work for a DDoS attack? Would it work for a vendor breach? Would it work for a phishing attack? Would it work for something else? If not, let's create a playbook. Because the incident response plan, a lot of people have them drafted not necessarily for the organization, maybe to check a box for a regulator or something, but not really to be useful. And I think we're at the stage now where it really helps to have an incident response plan that actually, like, nuts and bolts says who does what and when, in what order, and what we're doing, and all the contact information. And to Cindy's point, like, it's a constant work in progress. You're always adding and refining and making it more useful. And like, you'll see that like your executives will like want to do different things. Like your incident response plan may say that like your chief information security officer has to contact the FBI, but then in the actual incident, you find out that your CEO is like, no, we don't talk to the FBI unless I say so, right? And so if that's the way it is, then you got to know that, and that means your incident response plan has to change, because it means you've got a different reporting obligation, and you've got different. One of the reasons to do tabletops is to test all that and then make sure that whoever wants to be involved or needs to be involved in whichever decision, they're involved. And so the incidents, hopefully they're small and you can learn from them what worked, what didn't work, and make sure that your plan now actually reflects reality and is as useful as it can be.
So I want to shift gears for a moment and just talk about risk. We've talked about your own entity, your own organization, have a plan, test the plan, revise the plan, work through the details right up front so that you don't have to work through them in the middle of a crisis. Get your vendors in order, get your contact lists in order. I always say you want to avoid crisis procurement, where you're trying to get somebody on board in the middle of a crisis. But the reality about cybersecurity risk is that it's network risk, and to the extent that you are connected to third parties, that they have access to your systems and your data, that you have access to their systems and their data, there's risk that kind of flows in multiple directions. So I want to shift gears from focusing on kind of your own organization to that idea of third party risk and kind of risk up and down the chain. Like, what do we mean by that? What is this whole weakest link analogy in the cyber context? And I'm going to come back to you, Avi, to get us started.
Sure. And I mean, I think the regulators have become increasingly focused on it because they realize that, there's no point in you being totally secure only to give access to some third-party vendor to your network who isn't secure, or you give a whole bunch of your data over to some third party who isn't secure. And so you can see it with the DFS and the FTC and the SEC. They're all sort of radiating out their requirements so that essentially you get deputized to make sure that your critical vendors are exporting their regulatory regime onto whoever you give your data to, and they're putting it on you to make sure they have good cybersecurity. And so what a program looks like is first of all knowing who has access to significant amounts of our critical data or who have access to our network, and then sort of risk rating them and saying like, okay, who's high risk, who's low risk, and what are we doing? I mean, there's a limit to what you can do, right? So if you've got like an Amazon cloud contract, it is not like you are going to heavily negotiate the terms of your Amazon cloud contract. That's just not going to happen. But there may be lots of vendors for whom you do have some ability to negotiate in terms of getting representations about what they do and what their cyber is, and just maybe getting on the phone with them and just talking to them or giving them a questionnaire, having contractual obligations that they have to notify you in the event of a breach, that they have to protect your information, they have to cooperate with you in the event of an incident, and just getting a feel for, I think, who has your data that if they were compromised could be a big deal for you, and you would need to know that this was happening as quickly as possible. And also from a business continuity point of view, who have you outsourced a critical part of your operations to, that if they were down for a ransomware attack or something else, like that would be a big deal for you, and do you have a backup? We've seen companies who have cloud backups that, like, if one cloud goes down, they have an entirely separate version of something in the cloud. Now that's not what everyone's going to do, but like that's the point where we're at, where some organizations are so dependent on their core operations for outside vendors that they can't risk those outside vendors going down, and they have backups.
Sunita, any advice to the folks here about balancing sort of the business needs with managing cyber risk? Avi referred to the fact that if you're negotiating with a major tech provider on something, you're not going to be able to necessarily redline the agreement. But how should folks think about that in terms of managing business needs? And that can be either the business has a particular need with a kind of vendor that maybe you're not sure about in terms of their cybersecurity posture, or also somebody who is being specifically brought on board for cyber or data purposes and kind of getting to the comfort level you need. How do you think about that, and what's the best advice you can give us?
And I think that's a great question, because first of all, you have to run your business, right? So you have to be able to do what your company's meant to do. But in this day and age, you have to make sure you've taken the adequate due diligence, right? So whether that is maybe in a vendor choice, not picking the vendor whom isn't properly vetted or doesn't have the proper controls, you need to make that decision. And it's also really understanding what your business needs are and what your data is. I mean, one of the things, and this ties back to the incident response plan, it's the same point. IT can no longer be as siloed anymore, frankly. But like, this is now the part of the board needs to understand, your company's management needs to understand. So, is it so important to use this particular vendor? Do we really need to house it off-site? Can we do something internal? Can we put part of the budget to a backup system just with respect to this particular subset? And all of these are interrelated decisions in a way, because at the end of the day, what you want to do is that demonstrate you took reasonable steps, right? No one's expecting perfect, because that can't be achieved, but you have to show that you were reasonable and thoughtful and considered it.
It's a great point. And, again, just getting the right people to the table, making sure that IT and legal have a role in that vendor acquisition process, and signing up third-party relationships so that there's at least some oversight there. Maybe you don't have to pick the most cyber secure vendor for every engagement, but something that you should be looking at for those engagements where it's appropriate. So just making sure the right people have a voice. Wendy, I want to come back to you for a minute, because you are in a unique position on this panel with respect to third-party risk. Number one, you are a third party, right? For many organizations, your organization is a third-party vendor that supports the cybersecurity and IT infrastructure. And second, I know that your company also helps entities assess risk of third parties, right? So your company will come in and help, assess third party risk, either in connection with diligence and considering engagement, or even maybe after an incident in terms of an audit or those kinds of things. So, would love to hear from you on your thoughts on third party risk management, maybe some best practices or practical tips from where you sit as both a third party vendor and also in the work that you do with respect to assessing other third parties.
Certainly. So, I think that so many of the panelists have already come up with great ideas, right, that I'm really excited to hear so many people mentioning. I think what's pervasive here, though, that is so critical that we're not necessarily highlighting, is in order to do the comments that Avi and Sunita mentioned effectively, these different business components have to be communicating with one another. So there has to be, a need expressed for a business need or a communication expressed for that. And then that communicated, because so many times if we do that more effectively amongst a variety of stakeholders, we can get to decisions on the technical side that really limit the risk needed to get the business work done. So in addition to those communications and encouraging those, certainly having, as you mentioned, being a vendor myself, making sure that organizations who are deploying software in your environment do not require you to use a domain administrator password to do that. And many organizations will still say that's absolutely critical. They can't deploy their software without it. But if you push back and say, you know, well, great, we're going to go to a vendor that's more secure, that doesn't have that policy, they will absolutely find a way to work around it. So that's certainly a recommendation I have. Next, and we keep going back to data, right? The importance of understanding what your data is. And when we look at third-party risk related to third party, it's really about who has access to the data. So having strong access controls in place with monitoring and logging so that you can answer those questions as soon as possible is really critical. Ideally, you can answer those, you know, in advance, and we have that cataloged so we have a very strong understanding of who has access. That's often, you know, going back to the investigative lens and answering technical questions, that's often one of the longest poles in the tent, right? Is just getting back to be able to answer that question of who accessed this specific you know, account or application at this time. And if we have that in advance, that's really going to be an accelerator. Lastly, what I would say is, you know, we work with a lot of organizations who are consuming third parties during the course of an M&A. So having a process in place in advance of the MSA to assess the risk, but then to do some specific technical controls and assessment analysis of, is there evidence of an ongoing compromise already within that third party, maybe a previous compromise that wasn't cleaned up all the way, and ensuring that as that those technical details are identified, then a plan is put in place to mitigate those risks as we're moving forward if the business decides to continue with the M&A activity.
That's great. I'm gonna shift gears again now and talk about legal trends. So we're gonna get into sort of the more legal discussion with respect to cybersecurity risk. So lots of movement in this area. We've seen, you know, after you know, kind of a long period maybe where there wasn't so much development of the case law, it feels like it is coming a little bit more fast and furious these days, both with respect to the opinions that are coming out and also with respect to the legislation that we're seeing and the proposals in Congress and elsewhere. So Sunita, I'm going to start with you. What are some of the key legal developments that you're seeing right now related to cybersecurity law?
Sure. And I want to preface this by saying that I think you're seeing developments in two different areas, right? One is on the regulatory enforcement front. And then second is sort of a consumer, the recognition that customers and consumers have you know, are being more protected, and you don't just need to hand over your information and so on. With respect to the enforcement, you know, just for example, the SEC has recently proposed rules, right, relating to cybersecurity risk management that would require advisors and funds to implement written cybersecurity policies and procedures, right? And the idea is that companies need to be responsible now for their cybersecurity, and they need to understand it, and they are going to be on the hook if they're not following the procedures and not adequately advising clients and fund investors, for example, about the harms and risks they face, right? You're seeing a great uptick on the enforcement side. The FTC is being more active in this space, right? Whether companies truly are responding and implementing what they're saying when it comes to cybersecurity. They're seeing more increased enforcement actions. Obviously, state AGs are active, in this space. They're increasingly doing that. And I think it's the old days where a company could simply say, oops, or I made a mistake. That's not going to cut it anymore. And in fact, this is probably the single biggest growing enforcement area right now.
Okay, I'm gonna put out some speed round topics here. Forensic reports. Can we protect them as privileged or not? Who has views? Anybody have views based on the case law?
So I can jump in. So I think, there were aspects of forensic reports that were never really protected and by privilege, so very factual stuff that I think people tried to protect, and sometimes, people didn't challenge it, but I think from a real practical point of view, it was never really protectable. And what we've seen is I think for lawyers, the real value is to look at the reports and make sure they're not saying things that are unnecessarily like harmful, to maintain sort of the facts and create, documents that if you lose privilege over them, they are not unnecessarily unhelpful, and to try and really separate out the legal advice from the nuts and bolts forensic stuff. And we've had two reports often come, maybe from different vendors, one privileged that is really answering the questions that the lawyers have that have to do with notification and regulatory compliance issues, and then a separate forensic report that is for business operations for the company, for ensuring that the vulnerability has been closed and all those types of things, and those or remain not privileged. And I think it's expensive to have it, but it's a model that really works. I think part of the problem, there's a lot of push on getting to the privilege report if it's the only report. If there's nothing else, then everybody wants it. If there's a non-privileged report, I think the pressure on a privileged report becomes less.
Anna or Sunita, any reactions or thoughts about the ability to claim privilege over forensic reports prepared in the wake of a cyber incident?
I think Avi got most of it right, breaking out the report into two, thinking about what's really the legal analysis. One of the things that I think is worth really pushing back on is like threat intel probably doesn't need a full report. Really speculative stuff like that, getting that, you don't need to write down every piece of threat intel into some sort of forensic report that potentially gets discoverable either in a regulatory investigation or litigation. But I think really breaking out like what is the stuff that's going into a legal and regulatory analysis and making sure that that's coming through counsel or being produced by counsel. But like Avi said, I think the factual stuff in those reports for a long time was always sort of a questionable privilege claim.
Okay, the next speed topic, I'd love to throw it out to the group, and maybe Sunita will start with you, but I want to talk about standing to maintain a claim, for a data breach, right? We've seen courts go in different directions in terms of, what it would take to maintain standing under constitutional requirements, and what we are really talking about is the harm, right? What's the harm that comes out of these data breaches? How concrete is it? Or, is the harm that we're talking about, an elevated risk of harm? Do you have any thoughts on that, Sunita? I think we might have lost Sunita for a second on the video. So I'll start, and then maybe I'll kick it back to Avi and Anna. So standing, right? It's been a question what it takes to maintain standing in order to maintain a claim following an incident. Some courts have said that the mere loss of information doesn't constitute enough of a harm in order to maintain an action following a data breach. Other courts have said that just the mere loss of information does create an elevated risk of harm that is sufficient in order to maintain standing. So we really have kind of a split on the issue, and the Supreme Court has had a couple of opportunities to address this issue directly and turn them down. It's kind of gotten around to the issue a few times in a couple of cases, but does anyone see any changes on that front or anything interesting with respect to the split?
I apologize for that. I think it's a fascinating topic, and I don't know. I think that increasingly there's going to be involving case law, and whether the Supreme Court, with there's a lot going on with the Supreme Court, shall we say? So, so it's possible that this definitely will be addressed for sure.
Yeah, good.
And also, when we start looking at like CCPA and now CPRA, some of these statutes are taking that decision out of the court's hands. Like CCPA is giving you statutory damages. So you don't, they're already saying there's a harm in the statute, which is going to make it, I think we're already seeing California is becoming a really attractive jurisdiction for these kind of claims.
So Anna, I'll come back to you on legislative trends, right? So we've kind of talked about some of the case law developments and some of the legal issues that courts have confronted. What about proposed legislation or any legislative trends? You just mentioned a couple right there, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the states are more active for sure. Now that we have Colorado, California, and Virginia all sort of entering the mix. Federally, I believe the Senate finally got something passed this week. It hasn't been approved in the House, but will require some mandatory reporting around ransomware and breaches and that sort of stuff. I'm not holding my breath on federal action, but I do think the Russia-Ukraine situation has sort of spurred them into action. Also, it's a little bit more bipartisan than some of the other, I guess, more contentious debates that they're trying to settle right now federally. So I think states are super active, maybe for federal, but I would say one thing that is definitely active is we're seeing a lot of federal agencies issue regulations. TSA, DHS, they do not need the approval of the Senate or make it through Congress. And so they are active in this space. We have a lot of clients that have 24-hour reporting obligations now, and they didn't need to wait for federal legislation for that to really, for the sort of hammer to come down there. So even though we're not seeing laws like, with a capital L, we are seeing a lot of federal regulators implement very strict cybersecurity reporting guidelines, as well as baseline security requirements that are not an easy lift for a lot of organizations throughout the United States.
Sure. I know one question I get asked sometimes on panels is about if the likelihood of a 50-state standard, right? The likelihood of a federal standard for data breach reporting. I see we've already got somebody weighing in. I was going to pull the panel here. I'd love everyone's thoughts on that, Wendy, including yours. So Avi, I'll let you start, but we go around. I'd love to hear what you think the likelihood is of a federal data breach standard and why, if we can. Go ahead, Avi.
I mean, I think it's too late. I think you have too much differentiation between the states. I mean, California isn't going to come down in its rules, and there are a number of states that aren't going to come up to some minimum threshold. I mean, you may end up with some federal minimum standard at some point, but it's going to be the floor. It's not going to be the ceiling. You're not going to get preemption. I just think too much has happened, and there's too much differentiation among the states to get a federal law. Plus, it's very, very contentious. It's hard to imagine much bipartisan stuff coming out of this Congress that isn't absolutely essential, and this isn't absolutely essential.
Wendy, do you have any views on this? So, it's sort of a legal question whether we're going to get a 50-state data breach law or federal standard, but would love your thoughts on the implications and what happens.
I'd certainly defer to the legal minds here on those components of the work, but I was recently appointed to be a member of the Cybersecurity Review Board, which is a DHS organization, working amongst so many different federal government agencies and then commercial representation as well. So we've been tasked in particular to investigate the Log4j vulnerabilities and what's occurred with those, and moving forward, what kind of recommendations we can provide based on the findings that will enable more organizations to respond more effectively, certainly decrease these vulnerabilities. So while the result may not be the same law amongst every single state, I think I'm optimistic that we can at least move to some recommendations and legislation in different areas that does enable us to respond much more effectively in the future.
That's great. Sunita, any thoughts?
Well, I was going to echo maybe what Wendy's saying. So first of all, I agree. I think that sort of the idea of a federal breach law is not going to happen for a multitude of reasons. But I do think the federal various sort of enforcement actions might bring about some federal continuity. I mean, one example we haven't talked about yet is the OFAC sanctions that come in with respect to ransomware payments, right? So that no matter what is occurring, that affects wherever you are in whatever state. And you can certainly see that the more that federal agencies implement regulations and rules, and the more enforcement actions they take that then flesh out what direction and what's permissible and what's not, you could sort of have a somewhat of a federal standard shaped more by the executive branch than by the legislative.
Anna, are you going to be the one that says we're going to get the unified standard?
I think the preemption ship has sailed. California, these states the AGs are not going to let this go.
So too much state interest there, the 50 state standard. Got it. Okay, so we can expect that we'll do the 50 state by state analysis for the data breaches going forward, according to the panel unanimously. So this may be the most important thing I'm going to say during the presentation. It's the CLE code. So, if you weren't paying attention before now, please do. We have a CLE code. It's the 7th CLE code. So I'm supposed to tell you it's number 7. And the code is study, S-T-U-D-Y. For those of you that prefer the phonetic alphabet, Sierra, Tango, Uniform, Delta, Yankee. So study. That's the 7th CLE code. That's the most important thing you'll need to remember from the panel today. And I'll announce it one more time at the end. Okay, so here we are at this CPR annual meeting. We have to talk about arbitration, right? And what are the unique aspects of cybersecurity and cybersecurity risk in arbitration? And I think we could apply this to disputes more broadly, but I think there are really interesting questions in the context of arbitration, given that it's a product of contract, right? So, I worked on the working group that developed the cybersecurity protocol for international arbitration. I highly recommend it as a good bit of reading in terms of managing cybersecurity risk within the context of an individual arbitration. But really, the protocol recommends sort of assessing the risk of a particular matter, and then having the relevant parties decide on the appropriate security measures to put in place. So to me, arbitration has a really unique position with respect to cybersecurity, because if you're in court, you're kind of stuck with whatever doing in court, right? We have open courtrooms, we have ECF filing systems, but the bottom line is no matter who you are, if you're the plaintiff or defendant, you show up, you've got the same ECF filing system, you've got the same open courtroom. In arbitration, I think there's a real opportunity. So there's an opportunity, if you have a dispute, and obviously one benefit to arbitration is the confidentiality, and you feel that you need to maintain sort of super confidentiality over a very sensitive matter, you have the option by contract to agree to super secure cyber terms, right? As opposed to being stuck with whatever you're stuck with if you're in court. And so I think, there are unique aspects there. At the same time, arbitration often involves multiple parties, the arbitrators, the institutions, the parties, the clients kind of at the end, the lawyers, and not all of those are on equal footing. And so sometimes where if you're in court, everybody does file via the same ECF system, there are cases where you could be in arbitration where the different members have different levels of cybersecurity preparedness, just in terms of the business as usual approach to this. So, I think that there are lots of aspects of arbitration that make it a really interesting context in which to view cybersecurity risk, and cybersecurity opportunity. Sunita, I'm going to come back to you kind of on the disputes front, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to think about cybersecurity in the context of arbitration, even in a particular matter or more broadly.
Right. And I think some of it, you've already touched upon, is who's going to access the information, right? And I do think sometimes people don't sort of think about the whole range of various individuals and then the resources to access it. And again, it's kind of back to understanding your data, right? What is the information that's going to be discussed? How is it going to have to get communicated? And how is it going to be transmitted? And it's certainly an opportunity to make sure that, to the extent you want to stagger or implement tiered security measures, that you do so and do so appropriately. But it does provide, as you say, Micaela, an opportunity also to really maybe think a little more creatively or outside the box to make sure that you address the cybersecurity needs, but also, are able to communicate and take advantage of the benefits of arbitration. One of the other things we sort of haven't talked about, which is the whole insurance overlay as well, right? And whether there is an insurance component or what requirements the insurance has or doesn't have, which, whenever you're talking about cybersecurity, you also need to make sure this is arbitration or not, right? To the extent you already have parameters you have to work with, making sure you think about those, and insurance being one.
Anna, I'm going to come back to you. Do you have any thoughts sort of on the idea of cybersecurity in the context of arbitration and disputes. And also, I'd love to hear some more thoughts on insurance as well.
Yeah, I mean, not as much in the context of disputes, but I would say the insurance, the cyber insurance conversation has been tricky and has changed, I think, dramatically over the last 24 months. I think a lot of insurance companies got into what was a pretty lucrative market prior to 2020. And then the last 24 months have really changed that. So we've seen a hardening, I think, of the market. Prices have increased. Your premiums, I'm sure, have gone up. If you come up for a renewal for your cyber insurance, I think you're finding that your policy is going to be a lot more limited than it once was, and you're going to have just like a higher retention, higher premiums, all of that stuff. I think cyber insurers, got hit really hard over the last 24 months, and we're seeing just an overall hardening of the market. I think the other thing that's going to come out probably with insurers that are thinking about right now is we've seen that war exclusion test in the courts, I think, unsuccessfully. And Sunita, I think maybe probably knows this a little better than I do. But we've seen that war exclusion sort of tested unsuccessfully, I think, in the last couple of years. But if anything comes out of the Ukraine-Russia situation, I think it's going to be a new set of facts for courts to consider how that war exclusion applies in the context of a cyber insurance contract. And I think that's something that a lot of our clients are thinking about right now, because it's not the same facts as it's sort of previously been for other attacks. So I don't know, Avi or Sunita, if you have more thoughts on that.
But I can start. I mean, I think it's. I mean, I think the insurers have tightened up the language, and it may be the case that spillover effects from Russian attacks that affect companies may actually be under the exclusion and may not be covered. And I think, to the extent that kind of coverage was available, that you could have got it and didn't get it, I think that will be a factor. And they've really gotten good, I think, at drafting around what we call silent coverage. The other piece of the insurance market that I think is important to note is the underwriting process has become very, very onerous. And if you're not careful, somebody in your insurance group who fills out those forms may say stuff that isn't true, right? Like you may just say, oh yeah, we have segregated backups and we've got all this other stuff. And if it turns out that stuff wasn't true and it mattered, and the reason you got attacked is because you didn't have multi-factor authentication, or the reason that you need to pay the ransom is because you didn't have segregated backups, and in your underwriting process that was filled out, the insurers are now being quite aggressive about actually making rescission claims and just saying, look, sorry, we'll give you your premiums back, but we're not giving you this coverage. What you told us wasn't true.
It's a couple of trends that I've seen. So one, I do think that the market has changed, the pricing has changed, and the drafting has tightened up a bit. But I've also seen insurance companies kind of offering more services in terms of consultative services and maybe assistance to their insureds and on the front end, right, on the preparation end to kind of enhance the cybersecurity posture and reduce the risk of a claim later on. So that's one interesting development. Another interesting development, I think, on the insurance front relates to reporting, which is, I think more frequently we used to hear clients kind of making decisions like about whether they'd report a claim or not, whether they were just going to kind of, cover the expenses themselves and not make a claim, or whether they would make a claim and seek, coverage for whatever the expenses were that followed an incident. And I would say that in light of some of the tightening of the market, the diligence the insurers are doing, we see more kind of questionnaires and those kinds of things. And I think, Avi, that's what you're referring to in terms of, the cybersecurity posture, but also whether companies or entities have had incidents, right? Like, have you had an incident in the last year or two? So, if you're thinking, well, I really don't want my premiums to go up, so I'm not going to tell the insurer, I'm just going to cover it myself. What we're saying is that, you may not need to report the incident immediately if you're not planning to seek coverage for that particular claim, but you may be asked eventually, in connection with a renewal or something else about whether you've had any issues. So, you shouldn't necessarily assume that you won't have to report it to your insurer later on. Sunita, anything else? Anything else you'd like to cover on the insurance piece or on the disputes piece, right? How we should think about cybersecurity in the context of arbitration?
The one thing I would add that we didn't mention on the insurance piece is that it's not just when you seek insurance. I would say in the context of M&As, your reps and warranties insurance now, this is becoming a bigger piece of that assessment. And we're seeing a lot more sort of special indemnities in play, as well as just like a lot more questions from, I think, you know, it used to be a couple questions about this, and now we're getting a lot more in-depth look when we're trying to get reps and warranties insurance and more sort of tighter language around what's covered and what's not. So thinking about not just for yourself, but if you're thinking about an acquisition or you're in the process of one, I would expect the insurance process to be a little bit more complicated now that we're dealing with, I think, more sophisticated parties.
And that's true, right, with all sort of due diligence now on transactions. I mean, certainly there's a much more greater emphasis on, you know, assessing the cybersecurity risk in that context and making sure it's adequately addressed or carved out. So, I mean, I think the moral sort of here is that cybersecurity is here to stay with us, and how you assess and handle those risks is increasingly important on multiple levels. I mean, one of the things with the insurance, I would just add, is that insurance companies are getting much savvier. And so companies also need to be cognizant of that when they're thinking about the types of policies they need and how best to address and mitigate their own risks through insurance.
So we have a few minutes remaining. I want to kind of go around and survey the panel quickly. We've talked about the current threat environment, you know, the current legal environment. But I would put to each of you, you know, what's next? What's the next evolution of the cyber threat? What's coming down the road? And how should we be thinking about that and preparing not just for, you know, the last battle or the last war, but looking ahead and really getting in a mindset where we're ready for the next one. Interesting context in which we have this conversation, giving events in the world. But Wendy, I'll start with you. I'd like to hear from you. What's next in terms of the next evolution, cybersecurity risk?
Well, so I think I'll focus maybe on more of the tactical, right? What I think we're going to see in the near term, in particular, with the conflict going on in Russia and Ukraine, and I think we'll see more destructive malware attacks leveraged and moving certainly towards potentially in Europe, but absolutely organizations generally focused in critical infrastructure are much higher risk. But I would say any of these international firms that also have offices or network connectivity and segments connected to Ukraine, that certainly is an issue that we want to make sure organizations are really taking seriously. You know, a lot of the best practices we talked about with access controls and network segmentation can reduce risk there. We are certainly seeing right now a lot of information warfare being leveraged. I think we're going to continue to see that. So the use of misinformation to convey a certain message or a political message, absolutely going to be the case. And then some very interesting activity this week in terms of cyber criminals taking sides and working for a cause, and in many cases working against one another. I think we're going to see more of that, and just the dynamic nature of that and what that means to organizations who are attempting to defend themselves against a threat actor that is consistently switching gears. That's really challenging. I think on the positive side, though, I highlighted this earlier, but I do want to say that in light of current events, I think the collaboration that's going on between organizations who previously didn't communicate well together and the threat intelligence sharing that's going on is really going to set the stage for how we work as an industry moving forward. We've all had, wanted to do this. There's been impetus for this before, but it just hasn't really quite come together. And I think an event like this can really look to make cohesive those relationships and the collaboration that is occurring. So I'd like to think that we're going to see more of that in the future.
Great. Anna, any thoughts?
I think managed IT service providers and fancy tools are probably the next 12 months going to be the biggest thing. A lot of companies are willing to spend a lot of money on cybersecurity right now, but like the best tools, the best managed service provider you cannot buy yourself out of this risk. You still need people and processes internal to manage this risk. The best detection tool is nothing if you don't have an internal organization prepared to deal with it.
Great. Sunita, anything from you?
I just think we're going to continue to see some risks associated with sort of the return to work and people in a hybrid environment still, right? We've seen that there's a lot of sort of unique cybersecurity risks to the remote environment, and that's not going to end. So I think we're going to continue to see some evolutions in that area as people kind of go back and forth.
Avi, what about you?
I think the new stuff we're seeing is related to AI is sort of model theft, model poisoning, the big data sets being taken. I mean, the thing about AI is it's very data heavy, and you're taking a lot of data that may be in one location that's pretty secure, and you're moving it into these data lakes, which are not necessarily very secure. And the data scientists are just used to moving lots of data around and aren't thinking about it from a cybersecurity point of view. We're just starting to see, some attacks that are really targeted against either AI data sets or the models themselves. They're hard to defend against, and for a lot of companies, their AI development is like one of their most important IP things. And a lot of this is nation state stuff. So it's very, very sophisticated, and it's not something a lot of companies have really started to focus on, but they're going to need to.
Yeah, AI, IoT, deep fakes, lots of interesting stuff coming down the pike. So we'll, certainly have room for a cybersecurity panel next year. It's not going away.